Hello and welcome to yet another installment of the Algebra 2 videos. This is section 3 and this is factoring polynomials by double grouping. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to factor a polynomial by double grouping or indicate that the polynomial is prime. So factoring by grouping means group terms with common factors, factor out the greatest common factor from each group. Okay, sometimes use the additive inverse, but we really want to use the distributive property and then check our work by multiplying. So what I want to do is take a look at this and say, and determine, okay, so we want to take this polynomial here, 4x cubed plus 14x squared plus 6x plus 21, and factor it. We want to group the pairs of terms with common factors. So, what I see here is that I, can take a look at these two terms, and let's just do this. Let me just rewrite it. Let me zoom in here and rewrite it. So I'm going to go 4x cubed plus 14x squared plus 6x plus 21. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put parentheses around these two terms and then around these two terms, okay? And I'm going to then figure out what can I factor out of this set of parentheses right here. And the thing that I know is that, 4 doesn't go into 14, but I do know that 2 goes into each of these, and I can factor out an x squared. So I can factor out a 2x squared from each of these, okay? And I'm left with, on the inside then, just a 2x and then plus a 7, okay? So 2x plus 7, all right? And then what I want to do is figure out what can I factor out of this, okay? And from here, okay, 6 doesn't go into 21, but 3 goes into each of these. So I can factor out a 3 from each of these. And I'm left with, okay, what is that? 2x plus 7, okay? 2x plus 7. And so now what I want you to see is that I have now two terms, okay? I have this whole thing here, and I have this whole thing here. Now, here's the hard part, okay? I was always good about factoring out these parts, but then the next step is that I can now factor out a common 2x plus 7 out of each of these terms. And that's the hard part, is, it's easy to factor something like this because you see it, but when you have to factor a quantity out, that's where it gets tricky. So if I factor out a 2x plus 7 from both sides, from each of those, then we are left with a factor of 2x squared plus 3. Okay? And I want you guys to see that. Now, it's kind of hard to see it, but, now I've taken this whole thing here and I've written it as the product of two binomials. When I say binomials, I mean that's something that has two terms, okay? So that's kind of the gist of what we're trying to do here. That is what we are doing in a nutshell. And we can obviously check by multiplying, okay? If I wanted to multiply this out, I would use this thing called FOIL, okay? And so if I FOILed this out, then I would take, 2x times 2x squared, which would give me 4x cubed. Okay, I would take 2x times 3, so plus 6x. I would take 7 times 2x squared, so they give me positive 14x squared. And then I would take 7 times 3, which gives me 21. Now, this isn't in ascending order. Okay, I should put 4x cubed plus 14x squared plus 6x plus 21. Okay, and that's what we started with. Okay, and that's the idea. When we did the whole factoring thing in the last couple of units, we were just factoring. We were just doing this part. Okay, so we're taking this a step further and factoring out that piece. So, guys, this would probably be a good example to go back and rewatch on how to do this. So, but that's the idea. All right. So let's take a look at this one. Let me rewrite this We've got 12x cubed minus 9x squared, so we've got, all right, so we've got 12x cubed minus 9x squared, and then plus 4x minus 3, okay? So plus 4x minus 3. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to take a look at this, and I want to see what can I group up. Okay, I've got 4 terms here, all with a, with a polynomial of degree 3. Okay, if I take these and if I were to figure out what could I factor out of this, then, what I could factor out is what is that, a 3 and an x squared? So if I factor out a 3 and an x squared, then I'm left with 4x and then just a minus 3, okay? Now this one's kind of interesting because I've got, I don't have to do anything with this one, okay, with this term because it already exists, okay? When I factored out that 3x squared, I was left with 4x minus 3. Now I already just have a 4x minus 3 here, so I don't have to really do anything. But I will put this. I will put that I have a 1 out here, okay, to kind of help with what we're doing. I'm going to multiply that binomial by 1. Now what I have is I have a common 4x minus 3 factor that I could then factor out and bring out front. So if I factor out that common 4x minus 3, okay, I'm going to write that over here. I'm going to write the factor of 4x minus 3, and then that would be multiplied by what's left, and that's going to be a 3x squared, and then a plus 1, okay? And that's it. This is factored, okay? And I can check by, multiplying this out and foiling it if I wanted to, so let's check. Okay, so if I take 3x squared times 4x, that's going to give me 12x cubed. Okay, if I take 3x squared times negative 3, that's going to be minus 9x squared. If I take, 1 times 4x, that's going to give me positive 4x. And if I take 1 times negative 3, it's going to give me a minus 3. Okay, and this is what we started with, all right? So we got to be able to go from one to the other, okay? But this is kind of tricky, but it just takes time and some practice. Okay, let's take a look at this next one. And what we want to do is we want to be able to group this in different ways. Okay, so I'm going to take this, this polynomial, which is going to be 6x cubed minus 3x squared plus 4x minus 2. Okay, and I'm going to do it just like we've been doing it the last 2 examples. I'm going to group these two together and ask myself the question, okay, what can I factor out of this? Okay, and I have a 6 and a 3, and I have an x cubed and an x squared. So I can factor out a 3, okay, but I can also factor out an x squared. And I'm left with, then, a 2x and then minus 1, okay? And then over here, okay, I can factor out a 2, all right? So if I factor out a positive 2, so plus 2, then I'm left with just a 2x minus 1, okay? And at this point, what I can do is I can factor out each of these, I have a common binomial here. This part, the 2x minus 1, I can now factor out, okay? And so therefore, I'm left with the quantity 2x minus 1, and then I'm just left with what I've got, which is going to be 3x squared and a plus 2. And that's it, okay? And this is my answer, all right? That's what I've got. So now, let's go ahead and let's order this, regroup the terms in the polynomial, and see if we can factor this and get the same thing, okay? So let me rewrite this down again. What do we got? 6x cubed minus 3x squared. So I've got 6x cubed minus 3x squared, and then it's plus 4x minus 2. So a plus 4x and a minus 2. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to reorder this polynomial. I'm going to kind of switch these numbers around and see what we can do to get something a little bit better. Now, what I can do here is I can switch these two numbers, okay? And I'm going to rewrite this. I'm going to write it as 6x cubed plus 4x, and then minus 3x squared, and then minus 2. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor this by grouping. Now before I do that, there's a part of this that's kind of tricky, that kind of messes people up, and what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to rewrite it as 6x cubed plus 4x plus a negative 3x squared and then a minus 2. Okay, and I'm going to show you why I did that here in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group this up real quick, group these and group these. And so then, what you have to ask yourself the question, what can I factor out of this? Well, I can factor out a 2 out of 6 and then a 2 out of 4, in case 4 doesn't go into 6. So if I factor out a 2 and an x, okay, then we're left with a 3x squared, and then that's going to give me a positive 2, okay? And now out of here, it looks like I've got a 3x squared plus 2, but these are all negative. Now what I can factor out of here is a negative 1. So if I factor out a negative 1, then we're left with a 3x squared plus 2. Okay? Now, I have a common factor of 3x squared plus 2, so I can factor that out. Okay? I can factor out a 3x squared plus 2 from each of those, and then I'm left with a 2x minus 1. Okay? Now, the reality is that when you look at this, okay, it's the same thing that I got here. Okay? The order is different. I factored two different things out, but the reality is that I have this quantity times this quantity, which is the same thing as this quantity times this quantity. Okay? So that's it. You can reorder this stuff as long as you get the same thing in the end, and as long as you have the ability to remultiply this stuff out and get back to where you started. That's the important thing. Okay? That's what we're trying to do. Okay, so now let's do this. I want to factor this equation here. I'm just going to go ahead and group it the way that it's in right now. Okay. Now I can factor out of here, I can factor out a 3x squared out of this. So let me do that real quick. I'm going to factor out a 3x squared. And then that leaves me with a 4x and then a minus 3. Okay, and that's it. And then we ask ourselves the questions, okay, what can I factor out of this? And so I've got 8 and 6. The only common factor is a 2. So I'm going to do a plus 2. Okay, and that's going to leave me with a 4x and a minus 3. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to be able to factor out this common factor of a 4x minus 3. I'm factoring that one out, and that's going to leave me with 4x minus 3. And then what am I left with? Okay, I'm left with a 3x squared and a plus 2. So I'm going to do 3x squared and then plus 2. And that's it. And then it's factored. Okay, and that's our answer. Okay, so that's just factoring by grouping. Now, here's what I've got. I've got some other one like this. Okay, and what I realize is that I could actually combine these two and combine the like terms. Okay, but I'm not going to do that. Because if I were to combine the like terms, then this problem becomes a little bit harder to evaluate and to factor. Okay, and we'll spend the rest of the chapter, doing things like this. Okay, factoring things, factoring these trinomials. Okay, so in any case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor by grouping. I'm going to group this up into each of these, all right? And then I can factor out a 3 and an x out of this, okay? So let me factor out a 3x. And that leaves me with a 4x minus 3, okay? Now, if I look at this set of values, okay, 16x and a negative 12, I can factor out, it looks like a 4, okay? I can factor out a 4 out of 16 and out of 12. So if I factor out a positive 4, okay, then we're left with a 4x and a minus 3. And that's the key, is that you want to get the same thing here and here. Now I can take this 4x minus 3 and I can factor that part out, and that leaves me with 4x minus 3, and then times a 3x plus 4. And that's it, okay? And so we could always check, this by remultiplying it back out, okay? Okay, so now, let's take a look at this. We've already kind of talked about this a little bit. But, let's say that we, took this polynomial and we factored it out. Now, what we notice is that this term right here is negative, okay? And that kind of screws everything up. And what we've done is we've taken this and we've said, all right, well, let's, if you have x cubed minus 2x squared, here all they did was here they factored out an x squared, and that left them with x minus 2. But then here, it said, okay, well, what if we just factored out a 3? Then it leaves you with a negative x and then a plus 2. And these two things are not the same. Okay, they're close, but they're not the same. Okay, so, you have to kind of sit there and go, all right, well, what could I factor out of this so that it is the same? And the answer is you could factor out a negative. So if I rewrite this and I say, okay, you got x squared and you got x minus 2 plus 3 times negative x plus 2, okay, you could still sit there and then factor out that negative and say, okay, well, this is really just x squared times x minus 2. And then if you factored out another negative and made it positive, or adding a negative 3 to that, then that leaves you with just an x and then a minus 2. Okay, and then you have the same thing. Okay, so that's the idea behind that. So the negatives can kind of screw you up, but let's go ahead. Instead of having to make that realization every time, okay, let's do. So let's rewrite this without having to do this extra step. Let's just rewrite this over here as x squared minus 2x, x cubed minus 2x squared minus 3x and then plus 6, okay? And what I want to do is let's go ahead and let's rewrite this, like so. Let's do, and it's just because of this negative here. If you have this negative value in front of your x, in front of this third term, then we need to do this. So I always do this. I do x cubed minus 2x squared plus a negative 3x, use the additive inverse, okay? Instead of, it's just subtracting by 3, I'm going to add negative 3, okay, and then plus 6. So then, then I can group it, all right, and group each of these. So that keeps that plus sign there. It kind of helps me out. But, what I can do here is I can factor out an x squared, okay, that leaves me with x minus 2. Okay, now you have to kind of think about it. You have to say, okay, well, if I just factored out a 3, this part's going to be negative, and that can't be negative. So I have to just know to factor out a negative 3, and then that leaves me just with x minus 2, okay? So instead of doing the part where, and the difference is factoring out a positive 3 versus a negative 3. But my advice is to write this as positive, or, adding negative 3x is kind of my thought process on all that. Okay? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and skip this one because we're kind of running low on time. But this, okay, on something like this, all right, we call these, we have a prime polynomial is something that cannot be written as a product of lower degree polynomials, okay? So, and here's what I'm thinking about, okay? When you do this, okay, and if you were to group these together, and let me do plus negative 7, if I factor it out a 3x squared out of this, then you're left with 3x, minus 1. Now here, out of this, I can't factor anything out of 7 and 15. So because I can't factor anything out, I can't do it. It's not factorable. Can't do it. All right? No. Don't even think about it. Okay? And the same thing here. Okay? Out of this, I could factor out, if I group this up, I could factor out an x cubed, do a negative, And if I factor out an x cubed, then we're left with 4x and then plus 1. Okay? And then if I, look over here, I can't factor anything out of this. So if I can't factor anything out of both of these and get the same thing, then it's really not going to work out for us. So, but if we do have a non-prime polynomial, that means that we can factor something out. So if I group this together, okay, here I can factor out a 7x, and that leaves me with 3x minus 2. And here if I factor out a positive 5, okay, then that leaves me with 3x minus 2, and we get the same thing, and we can refactor that out. Okay, same thing down here, okay, I can factor out a 2x squared, and that leaves me with a 5x, and then plus, what do we got? Plus 3, okay. Here I can factor out a negative 5, or I'm sorry, just a negative, all right, and that leaves me with 5x plus 3. Okay, and you can factor these out as well. So that's the difference. Some of these you can do, some of them you can't do. Okay, so that's all I've got for this one. The next one we'll do about factoring trinomials when the value for a is equal to 1. See ya, bye.